Greetings from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. This is the sixth Sunday of Easter, and I'm preaching from the chapel here at St. Stephen's, and I'm preaching on the readings from the 17th chapter of Acts, the 3rd chapter of 1 Peter, and the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John. I hope you've had a chance to read the lessons for this weekend. Jesus takes a long time to say goodbye. Have you ever noticed that? In the Gospel of John, our Gospel reading for today, Jesus is at the Last Supper with his disciples. This is their last time together. Later on that night, Jesus will be arrested, tried, and the next day he will be executed on the cross. So this is his last time to spend with his disciples. This is his last time to give them instructions. So Jesus sits down with his disciples for supper and washes their feet in chapter 13 of the Gospel of John, and he is still giving them parting words at the end of chapter 17. Jesus has a lot to say to them. In a way, this makes me think of the times when Margaret and I have left town on a trip and left when our kids were younger, left the kids with a babysitter, and we would have pages of written instructions about the dog, the chickens, about what food to eat, what bedtime routines and household chores. Now, when we leave town and leave the kids to take care of themselves more or less, the instruction list is even longer. Of course, the difference is that we plan to come back, but maybe that's not really a difference at all, because Jesus is telling the disciples he plans to come back, but in a different way. But he is going away, so he needs to give his final words to them. So he begins, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Now, what are Jesus' commandments? Take care of the dog, mow the lawn, wash the dishes, eat the leftovers in the fridge? No, not that. Did he say keep an eye on your neighbor to make sure he doesn't do anything you consider sinful? Not that either. Did he give the disciples a long list of do's and don'ts? Well, not really. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus commands us to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, visit the sick and imprisoned, welcome the stranger. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives only one commandment. And he gives it at this Last Supper. After Jesus washes the disciples' feet, he tells them, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." Jesus takes 5 chapters to say goodbye, but in all of that, he gives just one commandment, to love one another. He says, "The one who loves me keeps my commandments, to love one another just as I have loved you." Seems so simple. But what does loving one another really imply? In the first letter of John, the author writes, "Little children, let us love not in word and speech, but in truth and action." And he goes on to say, "How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and needs and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Let us love not in word and speech, but in deed and action. If we see a brother or sister in need, do not refuse to help." Loving one another means talking the talk, speaking with one another with kindness, gentleness, compassion, and not with disdain, put-downs, and bullying. But loving one another also means walking the walk, to be generous, to share our resources, to relieve others in distress. A few years ago, Margaret and I left our kids at home to take care of themselves so that I could participate in the Festival of Homiletics in San Antonio, Texas. A week that was filled with sermons and lectures on preaching and worship, attended by thousands of pastors from all denominations from across the country. I'll be attending the Festival of Homiletics again this year, next week, but I will be traveling to it on my computer this time. The theme of that earlier festival of homiletics was preaching on the borders. So most of the sermons and lectures focused on boundaries of all kinds: cultural, political, national, racial, economic, religious, or sexual boundaries, and what it means to proclaim good news to those who are living on the margins or on the opposite side of the boundaries we create. An example of preaching on the boundaries is a story from our first reading from the book of Acts this weekend. The Apostle Paul preached to the sophisticated citizens of ancient Athens at the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was the marketplace of ideas, the place where the especially sophisticated folks gathered to show off just how sophisticated they thought they were. In order to proclaim good news to the people of Athens, who lived in the borderlands of religious skepticism, Paul noticed an altar dedicated to an unknown God. So Paul proclaimed to them, "That which you worship that you do not know, that is what I proclaim to you. This is the God of love, the God who created all things, the God in whom we live and move and have our being." And again, the second lesson from 1 Peter is another example of preaching on the borders. This time, it is the borderland of human suffering. The author writes to those who suffer for doing what is right. He says, "Do not be intimidated, but always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence." So what did I learn from that week at the Festival of Homiletics? Actually, one important lesson that made the greatest impression on me took place on my way from my hotel room one morning to the festival auditorium. The festival was in Texas, so of course it was hot, but it was cloudy most of the week, and on that morning, the clouds let loose with a downpour just as I was leaving my hotel room. I had taken an umbrella with me, but like most of the umbrellas at my house, this one was broken so that when it was opened up, one side just hung down limply. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it, but this morning's dash to worship really required an umbrella. I wouldn't get soaked with my bundle of papers with all the notes I'd been taking. I had my papers tucked under my arm, so I directed the umbrella into the wind and charged ahead. In no time at all, I was starting to get wet. I rounded the corner 2 blocks away from the hotel. I ran into a young man who stopped me asking for help. He said he was trying to get into the shelter of the Salvation Army, which was just a couple of blocks away, but they required him to pay a couple of dollars to get in, and he didn't have any money. The young man was already getting soaking wet, and I was certain that he wanted to get out of the rain. So I stopped, dug my wallet out of my pocket while I fumbled with the umbrella, still trying to keep my papers dry under my arm. He said, "Can I hold something for you?" So I handed him my umbrella, which was flopping in the wind, and we both got even wetter as I dug a bill out of my wallet and gave it to him. He thanked me, handed back my umbrella, and we went off in different directions. After I rushed off into the rain, I kept pondering that encounter, especially in the light of today's readings. Love one another, not just in word and speech, but in truth and in deed. And from 1 Peter, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Now, that letter from Peter was directed to the early followers of Jesus who were put on trial and who were suffering because of their faith. When was the last time that happened to you? When were you ever put on trial because of your faith with the threat of suffering for proclaiming your faith? Years ago, preachers occasionally would ask their congregations, if you were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? The question was obviously a rhetorical question because Christian faith, or at least the appearance, the veneer of Christian faith, is the dominant culture in this country, even among those who, like the Athenians in the time of Paul, are spiritual but not religious. But supposing you were put on trial for being a Christian, supposing that I was put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict me? That was what I was wrestling with after my encounter with the young man in the rain. I mean, I could have walked away smug and self-satisfied that I'd passed the test. I'd given him some money, but something nagged at me. Always be ready to give your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting of the hope that is in you. So the young man asked for money, and I gave him money. But did I give him an accounting for the hope that is in me? Did I give him any hope at all? After that encounter, I had a nagging thought that I didn't even ask his name. I gave him money, but I didn't give him hope. I didn't even acknowledge him as a human being. I didn't respond in gentleness and reverence. Gentleness and reverence would have meant offering grace and hope and love in Christ, as well as a chance to get out of the rain. If I had a chance for a do-over, I would at least have offered him a blessing. In his long farewell speech to the disciples, Jesus gave them a commandment to love one another, and he also told them that he would not leave them orphaned. He said he would send them another advocate. And that word is not a very helpful translation of the original Greek word in this context. The Greek word is paraclete. Paraclete means someone to walk alongside of us. It means the Spirit of truth, that Jesus now lives in us and is with us in every moment and every trial and in every celebration. Jesus is no longer with us the way he was with the disciples, but we see him because he is in us and because he is in every person we meet who is living on the margins or the borderlands of our lives. Jesus took a long time to say goodbye, but he left us with just one commandment: love one another. Love one another in word and in speech and in truth and in deed. And always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting of the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness